or ideas are actually pulled through that document, and we couldn't have done it without all of the help that we received from the private sector and academia and our international partners.
Let me talk about three things from a private sector perspective. Melissa's mentioned CNCI, and while the internal process inside the federal government to develop research and write what ultimately became the 12 points of light, or whatever we called it, once it was done, the number 12, which really impacted the private sector, the White House got through DHS with many of us, and we created an overarching name called Project 12. You might have heard that one discussed. The idea being is how can we take what we're doing in the private sector, bring that back into the federal government, and then bounce it back to the private sector for critical infrastructures. In other words, what are the best practices, the things we're doing, where there are points of light in the private sector where things are working very, very well. How do we now work with the federal government to enhance the resiliency, particularly of things like the power grid, financial services, transportation, and others that are highly dependent upon cyberspace to work. So over a period of several weeks, we had in Washington face-to-face working groups to take a look at this Project 12, or the 12th part of the CNCI, and bring that forward. We worked up a set of documents that went then back to the White House as industry recommendations, which were further refined and ultimately has become public policy now for the federal government in moving forward of making that 12th objective of CNCI come to life. As Melissa mentioned, the 60-day review, which was a little over a year ago, when that first started, we already had the momentum from Project 12, so it was fairly straightforward to grab those companies that had been involved in that previous effort, plus others, and provided a private sector input to Melissa's project. This was absolutely remarkable that within a very short period of time, we were able to get from a private sector perspective, what do we know that works? How do we think the federal government should attack this, both domestically as well as internationally? And they were very open and accepting of our input that was coming in. This was very different from the way the original CNCI was done, where it was a fairly closed process with no input from the private sector at all. The third thing, which has fallen also out of CNCI, is a national response plan for cyber incidents. This is something we've called for lots of years. In fact, even back in the 03 strategy that I was part of writing at the White House early in the Bush administration, we called for this creation of something that we can think about, a framework that if the country comes under attack from a foreign agent, foreign country, or otherwise, how do we respond to it? Who's in charge? Who integrates? Who coordinates the private sector as well as the public sector's responses? Today, that response plan has been written, and it's been a joint effort between the private sector as well as the federal government. It's not perfect, as no policy documents are perfect. It's alive and working. It's gone back to the White House for their review. It's bounced back into the private sector for our review. It's gone back to the White House. So lots of good iterations. And what we're coming up with is a cohesive plan that says if the country does come under attack, or if we feel that we're being threatened, here are the appropriate roles for the president. Here's the role of DHS. Here's the role of the private sector. Here's what we do at Verizon or at AT&T or Quest or even as businesses. What are they supposed to be doing here? There's so many more things we have to work on. One of the key areas is that of how do we protect information that we want to share across these boundaries. Government information, largely classified, about the threat, about evolving real-world things. How do they share that with the private sector so we can do something about it? Where I don't have cleared employees. I may be personally sitting on top of a nice security clearance and I can be read in on what's going on, but I can't swivel chair to my network operators and say, okay, here's what's happening. They're just not cleared for that information. These are things we're trying to work through. How do we take that actionable information and turn it into something that a system administrator can work on? And going the other way, if I see things in my network that will impact the running of the country or the national economy, how do I share that information legally with the federal government? Right now, we're all protected under privacy acts, so that I can't take things out of my networks and share it with the federal government. I can't legally do that unless I have a subpoena, court order, or some type of piece of paper. As a citizen, you don't want us doing that. But yet, as we move forward in this cyberspace world, this is one of these big public policy things that we're working very closely with the executive branch as well as the legislative branch and privacy groups and civil libertarian groups within the private sector to make sure we want to get this right. So this is one of those current public policy things that we're looking down the road to do that I think all this previous work has now set us up for success.
Just related to this, the issue is the definition of partnership. As we try to build these public-private partnerships, a different initiative at National Defense University this year was working as a sort of trade show / demonstration type of event with a private sector company. And they wanted to list our project as a partner on the logo for the demonstration, whatever. So our lawyers came in and basically said, you cannot have a partnership between a government entity and a private entity. Okay, so we took the logo off the brochure, and finally you go read the National Security Strategy. It talks about public-private partnership. You talk about the National Defense Strategy. It talks about public-private partnership. And so when I went back to the lawyers to say, you're right, the law has not caught up with the policy on this one, in the sense that we're interpreting this in the narrow definition of fiduciary responsibilities and things like that that go with the organization partner. But in fact, we've got to build these bridges. And so we're actually doing a peer-reviewed paper right now that'll hopefully wind up in a law journal that basically says just how can you use the word partner and what kind of relationships can you build between the public sector and the private sector in order to facilitate the kind of collaboration I think we all recognize is essential, but we're tripping over terminology.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is put forth a couple of potential policy issues and get perspective. What I want to do is start out with Randy. U.S. CERT has a cyber incident. I shouldn't say cybercrime yet, but a cyber incident's been reported to U.S. CERT, and they're going to go through their process of handling the incident, and then they start to look at it. The initial thought is maybe it's related to cybercrime, but as you dig through it and you start to figure out, walk us through the process of trying to determine, is it a cybercrime? Is it a nation state? Is it an act of war? Is it an act of espionage? And then what are the steps that you're going to take from a U.S. CERT perspective? And then from Randy, I'd like to have Mike talk about it from a DoD perspective.
Well, first of all, let's think about trying to contextualize. We initially don't look at things because we don't do attribution. From a CERT perspective, an event, an incident, is a series of actions that cause a cause and effect. We care about the TTPs, not who's pulling the trigger, if you want to use that.
What's a TTP?
Thank you. Tactic, technique, and procedure that the adversary may be using. So that's the first challenge, is getting the information in and finding out where it's been seen before, who reported it, how it's reported. Did it come through a censor? Did it come from a department agency or a company, which we have gotten reports from a company? Did it come through other open source reporting, et cetera, or intelligence? So we take that information, connect the dots, and we start looking at what the potential impact is of that activity. Is it targeted? If you look at the recent phishing attacks as they relate to like the G20 summits and things like that, we will say, well, it might be targeted to the organizations that are participating, so the information gathered can be used at the bargaining table. And we will work with the departments and agencies that were directly affected. We will then also take that information and come up with indicators and publish that information initially to the federal government, but we will continue to share that information through the information sharing and analysis centers, the ISACs, through other fora which we participate in, to share that information to start getting it to the widest audience. Our goal is to share as much information as possible in a timely and actionable method. But with that, it takes coordination with FBI, Secret Service, NSA, Cybercom, the Intel Community Incident Response Center, the NCI-JTF, and a lot of other organizations. We will share that information, and they will connect the dots, and we will then come up with a common strategy. We will publish documents as quickly as possible without creating, the unnecessary spin that sometimes gets tied back to what could be a relatively small event. Our challenge is understanding the environment. As departments and agencies are growing and changing their infrastructure, their security posture, et cetera, understanding how an event relates back to where they sit in the process of their mission space, and being able to say it may not affect, say, Department of Energy the same way it's going to affect Department of Treasury, and being able to focus those mitigation strategies, writing signatures for the Einstein program, and then sharing those indicators again as we continue to grow that. Once that kind of formulates, then we will also continue to share with international partners. We do work with groups like, as I mentioned earlier, the IWWN and others, to be able to share information and see if it's happening. Our goal is to take information that is happening today that may be reactive to one organization or several organizations, and share the information so it's proactive and preventative to others, which, sometimes makes it a challenge of itself because of I mentioned attribution from the sense of who's doing it, but there's also that, as Marcus put it, that attribution of who the victim is. A lot of people don't want to be on the radar screen that my organization had this effect against us, whether it's from an operational security perspective or just I don't want my name in the press perspective. And so how we share what information takes a little time to compile and work, but we work with the DoD hand in hand, since what we see on federal gov or state and local or critical infrastructure networks is more than likely happening or going to happen to DoD and vice versa. So we work very closely with the National Threat and Operations Center at NSA, as well as the Joint Operations Center at Cybercom, in being able to share that information and figuring out how that goes. Our unique position is we're not a regulatory agency. Real
quick, just to...
Go ahead,
so
coming up.
When you had that cyber incident, from a U.S. CERT perspective, you're not too concerned about whether it's an actual cyber crime or a nation-state type activity. You're going to treat them all the same from a perspective.
Right. So the thing is, because we're not regulatory, investigative, or intel, we let those organizations that do that make that in-depth determination. That's where that close coordination and information sharing piece comes from. The DoD defines if it's cyber war. The FBI does the counter intel, counter threat or terrorism, that kind of stuff. We just give them the indicators and the tactic, techniques, and procedures to help them understand it, and we work together, and they determine where those lanes in the road are.
Okay.
Of course, we're part of a contributor to that entire ecosystem of vulnerability assessment and analysis, really is what that comes down to. But Randy's right. We take a look at incidents in a slightly more analytical way. I mean, as we start to pull the strings and analyze what occurred, what software or whatever was injected, what it actually did, there certainly are a number of indicators that we focus on in terms of the genetics, if you will, of the exploit that was used. Have we seen something like this before? You almost get to know some of the exploiters, almost like the fingerprint of the sonic trail of a submarine in the old Cold War days, where you're tracking nuclear subs or attack subs. So you get to know who's at the other end of an exploit, not personally, obviously, but you get to know their fingerprints, how they behave, what they like to do, what code they reuse, all those sorts of things. And that's a pretty strong indicator of who actually did it. Is it legal attribution? Probably not unless a lot more research is done. And of course, we have the Air Force OSI that is our law enforcement arm that basically coordinates with FBI and works with them when it becomes apparent that it's a crime, rather than a nation-state action. And of course, in this instance, there's a lot of discussion about our obligation to help and partner, as Lynn would say, with the defense industrial base to aid them in protection of information that falls out from the development of weapon systems and other capabilities. So yeah, we're an integral part of the ecosystem that Randy talked about. We do, as a department, have a responsibility to make as good a determination as we can. as far as